Hey guys, it's J. Stephen Roberts here. Welcome to Real Crusades History. And we are continuing with our series of discussions on the 11th century and the rise of the Latin Christian West as a precursor to the Crusades. So, last time we discussed Fernando I and Alfonso VI and the rise of the Kingdom of Leon and Castile as the hegemonic power in the Iberian Peninsula in Spain. Today, we're going to talk about El Cid, the legendary hero of Spanish culture and folk tales and poetry. And we're also going to talk about the rise of the Al-Muravids. So last time we discussed how Alfonso VI of Leon came to acquire the important city of Toledo, capturing it from the Muslims. Well, this sent a bit of a shockwave through parts of the Muslim world, and in fact provoked a response from a powerful North African Muslim dynasty called the Al-Muravids, who decided to try and do something about this recent rise of power from the Christians in the northern part of the Iberian Peninsula. But anyway, let's take a look at El Cid. So again, El Cid is a legendary figure in many ways. I mean, he's a historical figure, but he has kind of been caught up in the legends and songs of Spain, and he's become quite famous. And the legends surrounding him have kind of come to obscure the true historical man. So historians have been working in recent times to try to uncover more of what we know historically about El Cid and separate some of that from the more poetry-based, traditionally based ideas about him. There is a very famous epic from the mid-13th century called the Cantar de Mio Cid, which has done a lot to kind of fuel ideas about El Cid that may not necessarily be historical, but may be more legendary. It is a magnificent poem, but nevertheless, it is not entirely historically accurate, of course, and it's much later than the period of time when El Cid actually lived, so that's to be expected. So, who was El Cid? Well, he was Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, a Castilian nobleman born in the tiny village of Vivar, 9 kilometers north of Burgos, on the eastern edge of the great Meseta of northern Spain. He was born into the Leon and Castile of Fernando I, the Great, who we discussed previously in our last talk. He was about the same age as Fernando I's sons, Sancho and Alfonso, and indeed, Rodrigo's first public appearance was in the court of Sancho II, who ruled from 1065 to 1072. He was in fact the chief commander in the military household of Sancho. So, when Sancho II was killed under rather suspicious circumstances in 1072, Rodrigo and the Castilian nobility suspected that Sancho's brother, Alfonso, had in fact had some complicity in the death of the king. Now, as we talked about earlier, Fernando I had divided his kingdom up among his various sons, with Sancho getting Castile and Alfonso getting Leon. So with Sancho's death in 1072, Alfonso really rose to become the dominant power in the kingdom, and eventually he would control the whole of the kingdom. So he is Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile. So El Cid and the Castilian nobility pressed Alfonso to swear a public oath that he had nothing to do with the killing of his brother before they would accept him as king. And Alfonso VI apparently did this. And there is still, of course, some suspicion among historians. Did Alfonso perhaps have something to do with his brother's death? He may very well have. But he did swear this oath, apparently. So Rodrigo continued to be a person of some importance in the kingdom of Leon and Castile. He played a modest role in the court of Alfonso VI. Now, if we remember last time, we talked about how Alfonso VI placed Al-Qadir in power in Toledo, or returned him to power in Toledo in 1081. You can refer back to the last podcast if you would like to refresh yourself on that. But during this period, it appears that our El Cid, Rodrigo Diaz, raided some of the territory that belonged to Al-Qadir, so some of the territories dependent on Toledo at this time. And for this, Alfonso VI exiled him to the east, so banished him from the kingdom. There's also some speculation, and this is more part of the legendary account as well, that Alfonso VI did this because he was uncomfortable with El Cid. That perhaps because El Cid was such a talented military man, and had been close to Sancho, that perhaps this made Alfonso uncomfortable, and so he didn't want him around. But anyway, this raiding on an allied territory, an allied Muslim territory of the kingdom of Leon and Castile, did not sit well with King Alfonso VI, and so he banished El Cid from his kingdom. So the Cid begins his exile in 1081. And during this period of time, he is going to serve a lot of different masters, or several different lords, basically acting as a mercenary. And he goes into exile with a small band of warriors. We could perhaps call them knights. Of course, the specific definition of a knight is rather obscure during this period, but with a group of men who had come to be his military companions and who he could trust, and who had a certain quality as fighters that El Cid, he needed men around him if he was going to be in this difficult situation of exile. And in 1081, he ends up in service of, in fact, a Muslim power. He ends up serving the Taifa of Zaragoza, ruled by a Muslim nobleman by the name of al-Mutamin. Now, this was actually a fairly ideal situation for El Cid because, in fact, Zaragoza paid tribute to the kingdom of Leon and Castile, so El Cid's former lord, Alfonso VI. So, by serving the Taifa of Zaragoza, El Cid was not doing anything that would sort of put him in conflict with his native kingdom, and also he kind of was helping to continue to serve the interests of Leon and Castile. So during this period of time, the Cid actually prevented other Christian powers from gaining influence in Zaragoza. Zaragoza was attacked at this time by Sancho I of Aragon, and also by Ramon Berenguer II of Barcelona. And the Cid managed to repulse both of these attackers. At this time also, Zaragoza was attacked by a Muslim rival as well, the Emir of Lerida and Tortosa, al-Muntir, and El Cid defeated him as well. So you can see how El Cid did serve the Muslims of Zaragoza well. And this also brings to mind the fact that this was a different time in the history of the Reconquista, of the Iberian Peninsula, than, say, the Crusades era. Once the Crusades began with the First Crusade in the late 1090s, and this begins to have an impact on the Iberian Peninsula and the Christian powers there and their struggle with the Moors in the south, well, this kind of changes the attitudes a bit. It hardens the two sides, and it makes this sort of situation probably a lot less likely. But in this situation, we kind of have more the insular politics of the Iberian Peninsula. So the Cid is really acting in a way as a part of that larger political dance and struggle that goes on between the various powers in the Iberian Peninsula, Muslim and Christian. And in this case, things are a little bit complicated. The Taifa of Zaragoza is kind of a client state to the King of Leon and Castile. So by acting as a mercenary captain or a military man for the Emir of Zaragoza, it's kind of allowing the Cid to function within that world. So this was before that more stern crusading mentality would have perhaps made the Cid less likely to put himself in the service of a Muslim. Now we can see the limitations of El Cid's loyalty toward the Taifa of Zaragoza, because in 1085. El Cid would not intervene to prevent Alfonso VI from besieging Zaragoza. Alfonso VI, as we know, in 1085, he takes control of Toledo, and he's kind of at the top of his game. He's really the hegemonic ruler in Leon and Castile, much like his father had been, but now he's starting to expand even more so than his father, and the Conquest of Toledo was a major event. This was one of the great cities of old al-Andalus, now coming under control of the King of Leon and Castile. So Alfonso VI's next step was to try to take control of one of the other great cities of al-Andalus, Zaragoza being one of them. And El Cid would not lift a finger to protect Zaragoza from his old lord, Alfonso VI. So we can see that even in exile, the Cid did still have a certain amount of loyalty to his old kingdom. Or, at the same time, Alfonso VI was the great power in the region as well, so I'm sure he wasn't interested in drawing the wrath of Alfonso VI. So now we're going to take a look at the Almoravid response to this great power that Alfonso VI has, and the fact that he's taking these important cities from the Muslims. So again, Alfonso VI was possibly at this point poised to dominate all of Spain. There was a real feeling in the various Muslim regions of Spain, Cordoba, Granada, Sevilla, that in fact Alfonso VI may soon control their cities. The Muslim poet Ibn al-Ghazal described what he perceived to be this great threat facing the Muslims of Al-Andalus. O people of Al-Andalus, hasten your horses. To remain here is folly. We live with an enemy who does not go away. How can we live with a serpent in the basket? So faced with this situation, the rulers of the Taifas of Al-Andalus, the rulers of Sevilla, Granada, Badajoz, they make an appeal to a Muslim power in North Africa, the Almoravids. Now, who are the Almoravids? Well, they originated with a man named Abd Allah ibn Yasin, who was sort of a preacher, an ascetic type preacher, who sought to revive the zeal and faith of the Berber tribes in the Sahara, the Muslims in that region. So he established a fortress monastery called a Ribat on an island in the Niger River. He attracted sort of a circle of apostles around him. And these men of the Ribat, called Al-Muravids, lived sort of an ascetic lifestyle. They practiced a pure and ascetic form of Islam. Meanwhile, they waged war against Muslims who they felt were not living up to their obligation as Muslims and sought to dominate them and gain power over them. They covered their faces with veils, and they had a rigorous observance of Quranic law. A lot of laxities that had perhaps crept in to the lifestyle of some Muslims at the time in North Africa, they would not tolerate. They would not tolerate wine. No non-Quranic taxes were tolerated, and they insisted on keeping to the Quranic prescription of only keeping 4 wives. The Almoravids came to prominence under Yusuf ibn Tashfin, whose dates are from 1061 to 1106. He was a Berber tribesman who came to prominence and had a talent for generalship. He was a talented military man. And under him, the Almoravids became quite powerful. Yusuf recognized the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, and he and his followers conquered Morocco and West Algeria, and basically came to dominate Western North Africa. So they become a great power indeed, one of the great powers in the Muslim world. Now, the Almoravids are quite different from these Taifa emirs or rulers who we remember from Al-Andalus. Now, as we talked about last time, the Taifas were these city-based little petty kingdoms in Al-Andalus that existed in the wake of the collapse of the Caliphate in Cordoba. So these Taifa rulers were considered by the Almoravids to be decadent. They were wealthy. Their cities were quite wealthy. They had a lot of luxuries. They lived the good life. Maybe were kind of lax in their practice of Islam. Meanwhile, the Almoravids were strict, rigorous, had no patience for fine garments or trinkets or any kind of luxury, insisted on a rigorous military lifestyle, a simple lifestyle centered around the practices of Islam and a rigorous military training. So in calling on the Almoravids to aid them against the Christians, the Taifa rulers really did risk being totally dominated by the Almoravids, but they just did not have a choice. The threat of the Christians in the north, of the kingdom of Leon and Castile in particular, was so immense that they had to pick who was going to have that hegemonic power. And Al-Mutamid, the emir of Sevilla, put it this way. He said he would rather herd camels for Yusuf than guard pigsties for Alfonso VI. So, of course, famously, Muslims object to the fact that Christians keep pigs, and so that you can kind of hear the contempt in his voice as he would have said that. Even if he's not too thrilled about herding camels for Yusuf, he'll take that over, the Christians. So Yusuf and his Almoravids dominate North Africa, Western North Africa, and they receive an appeal from the Taifa rulers of Al-Andalus. And so, in June of 1086, he crosses the Straits of Gibraltar and lands at Algeciras. He joins forces with some of the Taifa emirs, and they advance on Badajoz. So this was quite an alarming thing for the Christians in the north. As we mentioned, Alfonso VI was busy with a siege of Zaragoza. Well, he quickly raises that siege, and he appeals to Sancho I of Aragon for aid. So generally one of his rivals, he wants Sancho I to come to his aid. And indeed, Sancho I of Aragon does this. And this is kind of a precursor to what we're going to see far more often as we get into the Crusades era in Spain. Far more cooperation among the various Christian kingdoms of the northern Iberian Peninsula. Still some rivalries, but more cooperation. So Alfonso VI and Sancho I of Aragon march out with their armies, their combined armies, and they meet the Almoravids and their Taifa allies at Sagrajas in October of 1086. At first, the Christians are faced with the Taifa armies, and engaging in battle with them, they are able to rout them. Indeed, we hear from the sources that Yusuf actually seemed unconcerned about these masses of Taifa forces being defeated and slaughtered by the Christians. He said that they were his enemies as well, in fact, and he didn't care if they were slaughtered. So Yusuf now deployed his Al-Muravid troops, who used their unique style of fighting, which involved moving in a very tightly formed mass. And advancing on the Christians in this way, who were by now worn out, they were able to rout them, and rout them quite seriously. However, there appear to have been serious casualties on both sides. Both sides appeared to have lost quite a few men. It was a bloody battle indeed. There were so many heads taken from the Christians slain by the Almoravids that they were able to send them to all the various Taifa cities, Cordoba, Sevilla, and etc. And just as a display of the great victory they had just won. It was a devastating defeat for Alfonso VI and Sancho I. It was an absolutely devastating defeat. However, it was costly enough for Yusuf himself that he actually had to pull out of al-Andalus for the time being himself. And his son, in fact, had died back in North Africa. And so he had to go back and deal with that. But also, he appears not to have had the forces remaining to continue on with a major campaign in Spain. It's quite interesting. As a result of this great victory that the Almoravids won, the Christians nevertheless didn't lose any territory. Alfonso VI lost no territory. Toledo, the great prize that had been in many ways the cause for this major campaign that the Almoravids had launched, remained in Christian hands. And in fact, the Taifa rulers were pretty much left in control of their territories, so they weren't dispossessed by the Almoravids as they had feared. They poured gifts onto Yusuf. They poured out the wealth of Al-Andalus onto him in thanks for his aid. We can imagine that Yusuf, the ascetic, didn't greet this too fondly. So for the time being, Al-Andalus seemed to gain quite a bit of respite from the Christian momentum. The old order of things was upset. The old system of the Muslim petty city kingdoms paying tribute to the Kingdom of Leon and the various other Christian kingdoms, that changed. The Taifa rulers now refused to pay tribute to Leon. However, Alfonso VI responded to this with a major raiding campaign into Al-Andalus, so he did extract tribute in the wake of this defeat. I'd like to take a moment now just to let you guys know that for my followers who support me on Patreon, I do an exclusive podcast for them every Wednesday that's available only to them. Jump over to the link to my Patreon, which you will find below. So, El Cid, where does this leave him? In the wake of this great change, there was kind of an upheaval after this great battle with the Almoravids, and the old system of tribute had broken down. El Cid is going to strike out on his own and attempt to establish himself as an independent prince. He decides he needs about 700 horse and 2,500 infantry. So 700 knights, 2,500 infantry. And so he sets out raising the sort of income that's going to allow him to maintain that. And the way he does this is pretty brilliantly. He himself begins to extract tribute from some of the small Taifa states in the eastern part of the peninsula. And over time, he's able to acquire some dozen or so of these little cities and towns which are paying him tribute. He bullies them into paying him tribute. And he even gets Valencia in this position. So he gets to a point where he's got all these little statelets paying him between 10 and 12,000 dinars annually. So he ends up with an income of around 100,000 dinars. This makes him quite a considerable force. In fact, so much so that some of the major Christian kingdoms now become uncomfortable with the rise of the Cid. Yusuf and the Almoravids return to Spain in the late 1080s and launch an attack on the Christian fortress of Toledo. Alfonso VI appeals to the Cid for aid, but El Cid won't help him at this point. Yusuf ends up withdrawing anyway once Alfonso advances, and the Almoravids will return to Morocco again for the time being. But Alfonso is convinced that the Cid, that something perhaps needs to be done about the Cid. And in fact, he joins forces with some of the other Christian kingdoms and tries to undermine the little network of tributaries that the Cid has built. But the Cid is able to, through some tricky maneuvering, is able to avoid that. Now, in light of how things have been going, Yusuf, back in Morocco, decides he's going to change his policy toward al-Andalus. He no longer is interested in merely acting as sort of an overlord to the Taifa kingdoms and providing aid now and then against the Christians. He now decides he's going to directly rule these great cities and their dependent territories in al-Andalus. So regions like Granada, Cordoba, he's going to take them over. So over the course of 1090 into 1091, he begins to pick off these Muslim taifas. He takes Granada, he takes Cordoba, he takes Sevilla, he takes Malaga and Murcia. And a lot of times these Taifa emirs, he throws them into prison and sends them back to Morocco to rot in a dungeon somewhere. So the Almoravids now have an enormous empire. They now control Western North Africa, as well as the bulk of Al-Andalus. So things are very interesting at this point. Now in the 1090s, we have a situation where the Christian powers, the Kingdom of Leon and Castile, Aragon, and these various other regions, now are facing their greatest threat since Al-Mansur. So since the late 10th century. So things have really changed quite a bit. Now, meanwhile, Valencia remains one of the taifas that is not in Almoravid control yet. The Almoravids want to change that. Yusuf wants to take control of Valencia. He wants direct control of it. So he begins advancing on Valencia and conquering its dependent castles. Now, if you'll remember from earlier, El Cid had made Valencia his independent, or one of his tributaries for his operation as an independent freebooting collector of tribute. So he's not too happy about the idea of the Almoravids snatching that away from him. One of his major sources of income is his tribute from Valencia. So he sets out to prevent the Almoravids from taking over Valencia. So when an Almoravid army begins to advance on Valencia, El Cid moves with his army, which is smaller, into the field and begins to execute some maneuvers to draw them toward him. Now, things get very complex, and what appears to have happened is that El Cid kind of always stayed one step ahead of the Almoravids, and they kind of chased him around. And he would kind of threaten them if they moved toward Valencia, and then move away if they tried to engage him directly. And he always denied the Almoravids the proper ground on which they could actually launch an attack on him. And in doing this, he pretty much kind of ran them around in circles and forced them to retire. So the Almoravids had to depart south, they had to withdraw south without taking control of Valencia. So El Cid, against all odds, succeeded. And this is part of the genius of El Cid. El Cid was a military mind that stood out in his time. He used a lot of psychological type of tactics and was able to either terrorize his enemies or run them in circles, as he did here with the Al-Muravids. And so he was often able to punch above his weight. So we're starting to see some of his brilliance as a general here. Now, El Cid decides, in the wake of this near miss, this close shave he had with the Almoravids, that he'd better actually directly take control of Valencia. So he decides no longer is he just going to be a collector of tribute, he's going to become a prince in his own right. And he's going to do it by taking control of one of the great, grand old cities of al-Andalus, Valencia itself. Quite ambitious for a guy like El Cid. Over the course of the winter of 1093 and 1094, El Cid wages a relentless and brutal siege of terror, if you will, on Valencia. He does not have the force to invest the city, so he can't really launch a proper siege. So what he does is he has his men engage in all sorts of guerrilla tactics, terrorizing the population, preventing them from getting food. And he also engages in intrigue on the inside of the city. So he really has the Valencians on edge. His terror tactics work. And in fact, the following year, in June of 1094, he secures the surrender of Valencia. This is an incredible feat. This is something that the kings of the various realms of Spain had dreamt about. And now here El Cid has done it. He has taken control of Valencia. Now, the Cid was quite a pragmatist. Once he took control of Valencia, he expelled much of the Muslim population because he felt like he couldn't trust them, and he replaced them with Christians. He did allow a minority, of the Muslim citizens to remain in Valencia, and he gave them fairly good terms. He allowed them their property, the practice of their religion. So El Cid was kind of a pragmatist in that way. He was looking at the situation. It was a precarious situation for him. He didn't want there to be a large number of people in the city who would maybe do a revolt against him. And in a moment of weakness, let's say the Almoravids show up again, they're going to want to overthrow him. So he prefers to have a lot of Christians in Valencia rather than a lot of Muslims. Now, that doesn't mean that he didn't have a sense of Christian, a sense of, he's a Christian himself. He wants almost kind of a proto-crusading attitude. He prefers Christians to the edification of Christianity to Islam. No doubt that was there too as well. That played a factor. But I do think that was a big part of his consideration, was strategic reasons for getting rid of a lot of the Muslim population of Valencia. Now, how do you think the Almoravids down in North Africa responded to the news that a Christian Castilian dog had taken control of Valencia? Well, they were not too happy about it. They were horrified. So in 1094, they decide they're going to do something about it. Yusuf dispatches an army under one of his relatives to march on Valencia, and they are approaching Valencia in September of 1094. Now, of course, El Cid knew about this, and he wasn't about to let it happen. So he engaged, as usual, in a complicated intelligence action. He tracked the movements of this army. He wanted to know how it was moving, what the situation was. And El Cid determined that discipline was lax in this army. It was an Almoravid army. It also had some Taifa forces with it. And El Cid decided he thought he could take this army out, even though his army was considerably smaller than the one he'd be attacking. So, in October, he makes sort of an audacious attack on the Almoravids at Quarta. And it's fierce, it's hard-hitting, it's quick, and it's effective. He utterly routs the Almoravids. He crushes this attempt to dislodge him from Valencia. So let's keep in mind here, El Cid has basically handed the Almoravids, whose power is immense. They control an empire that straddles, Spain and Western North Africa. El Cid's the first Christian prince who's able to deliver them a real defeat. So he defeats them in battle here in 1094 in October, and that's it. The Almoravids, their attempt to take Valencia, it collapses. They can't do it. So the Cid's rule in Valencia is now secure. He and his family will rule from the palace in Valencia over the course of the next 4 years, because it just so happens that the Cid, while his success in Valencia was quite spectacular, he's going to die in 1099. So he dies the year that the first Crusaders take control of Jerusalem. So kind of poetic, I think. So the Cid dies, and with him really dies the prospect of Valencia remaining in Christian hands. The Almoravids are still very powerful at this point, and his wife is able to maintain control of Valencia for several more years. But in 1102, under the leadership of Alfonso VI of Leon, so El Cid's old lord, Valencia's Christians, along with El Cid's wife, are evacuated, and the Almoravids do end up overrunning it. And we'll probably talk about that in some more detail in a later podcast here. But yeah, so that's the end of El Cid's Valencia for and the end of Christian Valencia for the time being. Now, Valencia will later be reconquered by the Christians by James I of Aragon in his famous Valencian Crusade in the 1230s. But for now, the Almoravids take control of it. So El Cid's successes were brief, but they are quite striking. He's a very interesting guy. And I think, earlier on in this series of podcasts, I talked about how this era, the 11th century, is kind of the rise of the freebooting warrior, the mercenary out there looking for a kingdom almost. And El Cid is one of those guys. El Cid goes from being, just a knight from the court of Leon and Castile to striking out on his own. He's banished from he's sent into exile, and he ends up wresting, this kingdom for himself. Sort of a mini kingdom. He gains control of this great prize of the Christian kings of Spain had always wanted, Valencia. And he does it through just some, he's not able to do it through overwhelming military power. Far from it. He's pretty much always been outnumbered. Everywhere he's ever gone, he's been outnumbered. But he's a fighter, and he's a smart fighter. He knows his strategy, and he's adept at using maybe less conventional tactics. The psychological warfare element, the guerrilla tactics, the terror tactics. So he's quite impressive. So that's the story of El Cid, and I hope you guys enjoyed that. What we're going to get into next time is we're going to talk about one of the other great moments before the First Crusade, and that is the Norman conquest of Sicily. So this is important. This is, again, we started this whole thing with Ibn al-Athir, the Muslim chronicler's reference to the fact of these two major events that happened before the First Crusade: the rise of the Christians in Spain and the victories over the Muslims of Al-Andalus in Spain. And then he talks about the Norman conquest of the Emirate of Sicily. So he calls this, the sign of the rising power of the Franks. Franks being Western Europeans. So we're going to keep talking about this. Next time, we're going to look at Sicily and what the Normans did down there in Sicily. And I really hope you guys enjoyed this. I enjoy getting to talk with you in these podcasts. And if you like what I'm doing, again, I do have a Patreon that you can support. Also, I now have a PayPal account, so you can donate to me via PayPal. There is a link to that below. And your support is greatly needed and greatly appreciated, so thank you very much for that. Also, don't forget to check out my book, Why Does the Heathen Rage? A novel of the Crusades. There's a link to that below. And I also have a CD out, Scatheless, which features my song Templar on it. So there's a link to that as well. Check that out. Thanks so much, guys. I also want to remind you to be visiting realcrusadeshistory.com because we have the blog there, which features some amazing articles written regularly by Dr. Helena Schroeder, who's also a novelist who writes some great historical fiction, and she's also an incredible historian. Check out her articles there, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks.